PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt, and I am lead faculty for clinical management of the fitness athlete pregnancy and postpartum. So this is the first time that I'm trying to go live on both Instagram and Facebook. I am finally taking Alan's advice and getting onto Instagram. So if I look like I'm looking at two screens, I'm just trying to figure this out. So what we're going to be talking about today is some of the stuff that we talk about in our postpartum course. So our clinical management of the fitness athlete pregnancy and postpartum is an 8-week online course that talks about essentially how to help women during their pregnancy to stay active, specifically in the functional fitness space. So thinking about CrossFitters, weightlifters, powerlifters, and then how to get them to return to sport postpartum. And so if you're interested in that, our next cohort is starting in September, and we're actually doing a bit of a revamp of the course, and we're going to be bringing in trying to conceive piece, because that's a lot of the questions that we get as well, is around, if I'm trying IUI or IVF or I'm trying to get pregnant, is there anything that I need to do in order to make sure that I'm keeping myself as healthy as possible, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so with our course being about returning to sport, this got me thinking a lot about sport-specific pelvic floor training. And in general, I feel like the women's health space has been changing a lot over the last several years. So before, it used to be like the general recommendation to do Kegels after having a baby was considered kind of this blanket statement that was happening with the pelvic floor space. That's not from providers, that's pelvic floor providers rather, that's more from just the general consensus around what you do after having a baby. And since then, I feel that pelvic floor physiotherapists have done a really great job of saying, there's so many other things that can go wrong. I shouldn't say go wrong, that could happen. Your muscles can be too tight, they can be too loose, they can need strengthening, they could need relaxation. And so for these athletes that are trying to return to CrossFit, trying to return to weightlifting, they may actually need some very specific recommendations based on the assessment. And what that made me think about is some of these post-surgical recommendations for return to sport. So you have a ACL reconstruction. There are protocols in place for you to return safely and have the strength around your joint in order for you to go back safely or reduce your risk of re-injury. But that doesn't necessarily happen when we're thinking about a woman who's postpartum. And if she delivered via C-section, she had a major abdominal surgery as well. Or if she delivered via vaginal delivery and had some perennial tearing, then she is also recovering from a pretty extensive musculoskeletal injury. And so for what we need to really do is think about, can we conceptualize the needs and demands of a sport and use that in order for us to have clinical reasoning and have some justification behind our recommendations. And right now the research just isn't there. The research for this is coming out, and we have seen a huge boom in the recommendations around returning to sport postpartum, but we still have a ways to go. And that was one of the things that I started considering is, what are some of the things that are happening in practice that we can pull together in order for us to have some sort of thought process behind how we are getting these women to return to sport postpartum. And so one of the things that I thought about was doing this sports analysis. We do it often for other musculoskeletal injuries. Tom Goom and his team did a great job of his return to running postpartum, but I think we need to do this for CrossFit too. And what often tends to happen in the pelvic space is people go to see a pelvic health PT if they're having issues with basic functions like coughing, sneezing, chasing after their child, and they're experiencing some leakage. But what we're seeing in the literature when it comes to powerlifters and weightlifters is that oftentimes their body is able to manage the pressure of those activities, so of coughing and sneezing, but they can't manage the pressure of a 95% max clean and jerk, or when they're pulling a max deadlift off the the floor, and what that's creating is this peeing on the platform type of issue that has been coming up on, there's been more attention to it. And so what is happening there? And so if you have an athlete who is a weightlifter or powerlifter, we're going to think that the body needs to adapt to a maximum stimulus. So instead of having to have a low grade stimulus, we're going to need to have a max. And what we think about that in strength and conditioning principles, if we're thinking about endurance, we're thinking that our exercise prescription to have an athlete ready to perform a more endurance-based activity is higher rep ranges. And oftentimes the prescription for pelvic floor muscle training is this sets of 15 to 20, because in general, our pelvic floor has to support the organs in our bladder and our other sexual function organs that is supporting us throughout the day. When you're thinking about a weightlifter, powerlifter, or a CrossFitter who's lifting heavy, that isn't necessarily the prescription. What they need is to be able to reflexively and instantaneously create a max muscle contraction in order to support their continence and make sure that when they're in a more vulnerable position, like the bottom position of a sumo deadlift or the bottom position of a squat or a clean, that they're able to have enough of a contraction of their pelvic floor musculature in order for them to maintain their continence during the lift. The other thing that we want to think about is that as an athlete, especially for myself as a postpartum athlete, the last thing that I want to be thinking about in terms of a sense of doubt when I'm going onto the platform is if I'm going to be embarrassed because I'm having a hard time maintaining my continence, or I'm worried more about my pelvic floor than I am about my technique, than I am about my performance, than I am about, my legs capacity to be able to lift this weight. And so what we're starting to see is that we almost need to take the sport-specific approach to pelvic floor muscle training like we are with our other return to sport protocols. And what we can do for that is first of all, change our exercise prescription. So what we are going to think about is that if we have an athlete who's returning to running, then we're probably thinking that we're going to be using an endurance type prescription when we're doing pelvic floor muscular training. When we're having an athlete who's trying to get back to heavy sport, then we're going to need to have the athlete have the capacity to do a maximum contraction for less repetitions. And so that's going to be more in the strength building side of the spectrum when it comes to strength and conditioning prescription. So if we have that athlete who is getting to max weights and starting to feel like they are losing their continence, or if they go any heavier that they're going to pee, that means that we know that at that level, our pelvic floor musculature isn't strong enough to handle what we're asking it to do. And that's similar to if we ever get pinned on a squat or a clean. If we go to the bottom of the squat and then, oh shoot, I can't get back up anymore, then we know that the musculature in our lower extremity, whether it be our quads, hamstrings, glutes, has reached that critical threshold where it can no longer contract to the capacity that it needs to. And what ends up happening is we bail the squat. When we get to that period, or we get to that point in the pelvic floor muscle, we leak. So it ends up being flatulence, this feeling that we're going to lose our bowel or we're going to lose our bladder depending on what's going on with that athlete, and that is our critical threshold. And so we can use that information in order to continue on with this sport-specific paradigm. So we can, first off, we want to know what our exercise prescription is, right? We want to break down what the athlete is doing, what the athlete is trying to achieve, how far they are postpartum, what their baseline level of strength or endurance is depending on what they're looking for. Then we're going to try and figure out where their thresholds are. Are they able to manage pressure at 60% of their 1 rep max? Are they able to manage their pressure at 70% of their 1 rep max? Are they able to manage their pressure and their continence in 10-minute runs versus 15-minute runs? That's going to give us the threshold for that athlete. From there, we're going to apply those exercise prescription protocols and try to increase their capacity, whether it be their maximum strength or their endurance. And so when we take that threshold, we want to apply progressive overload. And in order to provide progressive overload, we have to have an objective measure, which is why pelvic floor physiotherapy assessment with an internal digital exam is considered the gold standard right now. But if you don't have that, then you can use all of these other variables to try and get a general idea of where their capacity is. And then from there, continue to apply progressive overload as their body gets stronger, including their pelvic floor. The other thing that we're starting to see is that we have to start thinking about pelvic floor muscle training with athletes like they're returning from any other injury. So if you have a CrossFitter who is trying to return after a shoulder injury and you're trying to get them to hang from the bar, having pain in that joint is not usually a bad thing. It's an information point. It's a data point that we use to know when we're potentially pushing it too far. We have to think the same thing with incontinence. So as I return to postpartum weightlifting, when I got into new thresholds, so when I was trying to postpartum PR, where I was trying to hit a weight that I hadn't hit in many months, I was having issues where I felt like if I went any heavier that I would become incontinent or I would have a leaking episode. And that to me was okay. Then I was like, okay, so that's where my pelvic floor muscle strength is at. And what tends to happen with athletes who are returning postpartum is that as soon as they start to leak, we start really traveling back and saying, okay, we're going to get rid of all of these exercises and then we're going to modify to X, Y, and Z. And we don't necessarily need to do that. We can change a lot of these other variables just like we would if we were returning to sport after any other injury, right? So if individuals have pain squatting below parallel, we might get them with their return to sport post ACL, post meniscus, we're going to get them above 90 degrees and get them box squatting for now. The same thing we can do when it comes to pelvic floor muscle training. And this change in my mindset around approaching postpartum care has been really game changing for me because it allows me to really pull and draw on a lot of these other areas of research that are much better established than the postpartum return to fitness protocols are, because we just don't have the literature right now, the literature base to support creating evidence-informed guidelines. But what we do know is how we return to sport from other muscular injuries. And so we can blend the two worlds of sports physical therapy as well as women's health to create the sport-specific muscle training. And it comes from really breaking down the movements that are required from these athletes and applying the layers of exercise prescription that we already know and use every single day in our practice. So I hope you guys found that helpful. So what I want you guys to consider is when you have a woman who is returning to sport postpartum, you have to do an analysis of their sport. You have to know what they have to be able to do. Do they have to maintain a low-grade contraction of their pelvic floor muscle for long periods of time? Or do they have to be able to have a maximum amount of strength in order for them to maintain continence under heavy load? So those are we have to differentiate between those two. Or are they a fitness athlete and they pretty much have to be able to do both? From there, we want to know what is their baseline level of strength in those pelvic floor muscles. Are they too tight? Are they too loose? Do we need to work on strengthening? The other side of this coin that I didn't dive into today is, do they actually need more relaxation? But that's a whole other topic. So what is their baseline level of strength? Do they have the necessary endurance? Do they have the necessary strength? What is their objective strength threshold? So if they are going back to fitness postpartum, are they okay up to 65 pounds on the snatch? And then once they get to 75 pounds, it's too much? That is a really important data point for us to be able to apply progressive overload. From there, we're going to go sub-max and start increasing our volume sub-maximally, and then push back into that 75 pounds threshold again, just like we would for any other musculoskeletal injury. And so I think we are, in a good place when it comes to women's health, that we are starting to see that we are really shifting our thinking to allow these women to return to sport postpartum. And this is just one way for us to conceptualize that and do that a little bit more, with a little bit more kind of clinical reasoning behind us. All right. Thank you guys so much. You're going to be seeing Kelsey and I every second Monday. We're going to be switching off with Guillermo. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little switch in time and space and topic. So you guys are going to be seeing postpartum and pelvic floor related topics a lot more frequently on the podcast, which is so exciting. If you guys are looking for more information on our clinical management of the fitness athlete pregnancy and postpartum, you guys can check out ptonice.com under the online courses. Our next cohort starts in September, and we deep dive into all of this good stuff. So have a great start to your week. I hope you guys have a very happy Monday, and I'll see you all actually on Wednesday, where I change hats and I get onto Jerry on ice. Bye, guys.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.